Hello, my name is Jeff Young, and today's story is one of ancient Egypt, but not an ancient Egypt that you or I know, rather an alternate one, where people, when they are found to have a tremendous ability to remember things, are given special training and given over to the priesthood. What happens whenever there isn't a priesthood anymore? It's also a murder mystery, so things may get a little rough, and we're going to start off right away with a murder. This is The Witness of the Senses. Rough stitchery joined the jackal's head to the man's neck. The severed head in the corpse's lap was turned so that the eyes were looking at this unnatural surgery. He was seated, legs crossed, leaning against a hieroglyph-covered wall. A hank of his dark wig was tied to a reed, imitating a flail, and placed in his right hand. The left hand held another reed, twisted into the curve of a crook. Trails of blood radiated outward across the wall, but they were not the spray from a wound, but rather painted outwards as though rays extending from the victim's head. The tongue was also gone from the corpse's head, and showed protruding from the jaws of the jackal. Nemtari cursed her perfect memory, wishing the horror of what she saw could be erased, excised like the images of the old gods from the walls of the temple of Karnak. She pulled her black shawl tight in, drawing a ragged breath. But she was an eye of Horus, and as Aten had supplanted the old ways, her destiny was overwhelmed by any thought of a normal life. She turned and bolted down the walkway to escape the scene of the butchery of yet another innocent. Blessed with a perfect memory, further honed by the endless testing of the priests, she could never forget. Fortunately, Nemtari ran headlong into her guardian. His rough hands caught her and spun her around, thrusting the beaten gold mask into her hands. Even though she hated the wretched thing, it was familiar, and in that way it was a comfort. So like a hawk, she allowed herself to be hooded, to calm her racing mind, and the cleverly designed eye slits only allowed her to look down so that she could move without stumbling. If she was like a hawk, then her guardian was the jesses that kept her from flying free. She reached out a hand, and he placed it onto his shoulder and led her into the streets of Karnak. Even though she was trained as an observer, her mind was drawn to the similarities to the prior murders. Instead, she focused on the accelerated beating of her heart. Thinking about the other three cases would bring the images into absolute clarity, making her relive the witnessing once again. She had to preserve the completeness of her current impressions for Asura, the guardian of the living light, Pharaoh Akhenaten. She plunged into the heat of the afternoon, exiting the cool interior of the temple. Nemtari could see the feet of the passers-by hurrying away. They saw the gold hawk's head and stylized eyes, and unaware she could not see their faces. Everyone was guilty of something. No one wanted to be recognized by someone who could never forget their likeness. Could the murderer be walking the streets right now with her, Nemtari wondered? Coming to a stop, she turned about, the beating of her heart once again fast and erratic. Sooner or later, the killer must make a mistake. The guard in front of her gave a moment's respite and then placed his hand over hers, squeezing hard. It was an unsubtle reminder that they were due to report in. When Nemtari arrived at the barracks of the Pharaoh's guard, two warriors joined them, and she could see their dusty sandals on either side. They led her onward into the presence of the man who once led the armies of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the living light. Her guardian turned under her hand and then reached up to the mask, unlacing it from her head. She blinked, shook her head to clear it, and then turned to her master. Seated in the darkened room on an immense throne of mahogany, a wood the same color as his sun-tempered skin, Asura waited for her to approach. His presence still gave her pause, but that presence couldn't overwhelm the harsh fact that Asura was a cripple. During his defense of the pharaoh against his predecessor's violent revolt, the severing of his left hamstring by the rebel left him a virtual prisoner of his throne. Nemtari felt uneasy every time she thought about the man who held the office of the guardian of the living light before Asura. Akhenaten, the light of Aten, pharaoh of all Egypt, had expunged his name from existence just like the old gods. She shook herself. That was her memory once again, focused on the past. She sniffed the air as she stepped forward. A cone of temple incense burned in a nearby corner. She drew in its scent as she dropped to her knees before Asura, closing her eyes, and remembered. The scarred walls and the pillars rose upward, their facings covered with hieroglyphs, and the rough shattered lesions where the names and images of the ancient gods were once removed and expunged, wiped out by the blinding light of Aten. A sharp odor pricked her attention. It was metallic, but also musky, human. Her eyes snapped open, going to the blood running down the side of Asura's hand and the brass dagger in his other. The two scents commingled, and her thoughts gelled into complete clarity, bringing back the images once again. The recreation of Anubis seated upon its crimson halo. The scratch of the scribe's pen on papyrus continued as she recounted to Asura everything she had seen. And then came his questions, one after another. Asura wiped the blood from his blade, and Nemtari stilled her concern for him. She knew eyes were trained to key in on the strong impressions, trigger the best recall, and scent was the strongest of all. She spared a moment to glance at Asura, his brow furrowed in thought. He had her repeat the symbols at the ends of the lines of blood twice to be sure. His next action startled her. Nemtari, what do you think? She wasn't used to having her opinion asked, and her thoughts raced in all directions. A disgruntled priest would have had reason as well as access to the victims, since they were all found in the temple. All of the unfortunate ones were also either scribes or priests. A true believer in the old gods might have reason to rebel, but the priests knew each other from childhood. They were raised together, and if such a person existed among them, then the others must harbor him. She trailed off, and then she realized the significance of the symbols on the wall. They read, "In the dying of the light, all senses fail." She, after saying it with a surprised tone, Asura graced her with a smile. "I wanted to be sure you saw it as well. I agree that a priest is the obvious consideration, and I understand your reservations. They make sense. Are you sure there were no other symbols in the prior instances?" Nemtari took a jittery breath and closed her eyes. No, she did not want to revisit the other two deaths, but the only way to stop another was to remember once again. It came to her. Darkness, the flicker of a torch, another dead man crowned with the head of an ibis. Two empty sockets glistened in the head on the victim's lap, blood drawn as a circle with radiating rays about the seated corpse. That was the first one. She shook with reaction and the remembrance of the second body rose before her. She knew it wasn't before her, but the trance of recall was so complete she could smell the soaked reed mats that were scattered about the floor. Seated, the body of the second victim bore the head of a ram. Blood was drawn as a crescent moon in front of the mats. Several fingers from both hands made a gruesome nest that cradled the body's head. And now part of her wondered if she could ever become unmoved by such sights when there were such fresh horrors to be seen with each passing day. Asura smiled, and then she knew he was satisfied with her work. She came and sat next to him. As he ran his huge, calloused hands through her hair, she leaned against his leg. His heavy brass wrist cuffs reflected the dim torchlight. He hummed an old folk song, staring into the distance, deep in thought. The moment of peace that she felt was interrupted by her churning thoughts. She stiffened. All the heads in the victims' laps were turned so they looked at the body. Nemtari wondered, what could it mean? She sat upright, and Asura's hand fell from her as he turned towards her. "What child?" he asked. Nemtari sat staring into the dim recesses of the room, the incense triggering the memory she needed. The mats under the second body. There was something that extended from the horns of the crescent moon under the mats. Did they lift up the mats when they moved the body of the second man, Master? Asura leaned back with a pleased smile on his face. "You and I are no nearer a solution, but now you are beginning to think towards one. Yes, there was a circle drawn so the shape of the moon lay against the curve of its edge, and there were rays radiating outward from it." She could picture it, the sun with the crescent of the moon across its face. An eclipse blotting out the light. And suddenly she thought, could this be a threat against the pharaoh? She looked downward, stunned. Asora reached out and tipped her chin back so she was forced to look him in the eye. You see it, don't you? Now you know why I am dealing with this. Nemtari, we do not have much time. Our killer is going to act again, soon, and eventually they will move against the pharaoh. We cannot allow this to happen. Go, summon the gods. We will question the priests yet again. She stood and bowed to him. Turning on her heel, she made it halfway across the floor and then stopped. Without turning about, she said, You already know it's none of the priests, do you not? You are learning, child, but I want whoever is doing this to continue to believe we are focused on the priests. It may even be true that one of them is aiding the killer. As we search for more information, we withhold other facts to conceal our true intent. When Nemtari walked across the courtyard to the dormitory where the eyes of Horus lived, she thought, was Asora in danger? He was like a father to her, and she couldn't bear the thought of any harm coming to him. Just thinking like that reminded her of her childhood. She'd been raised by the priests and trained in the arts of remembrance. It was her job to observe the rituals and the meetings of Karnak's merchants as a witness. When the priests no longer performed the rituals to the old gods, they no longer needed to be witnessed. After his wound, Asora had learned of the eyes and commandeered them for his own purposes. She stopped, held out her arms, and the warm sun and chill air of spring made Nemtari recall spending time by the flooding Nile watching the priests pray for the return of the waters with the life-giving soil. But now there were no gods to thank. Before the priests would blame the gods for lack of rain, the failure of the crops, or the unhappiness of the people, and create a plan of rituals to bring things back into balance. Now, there was only one god to blame when things went wrong, but Aten, who walked the land among men, was not a god that accepted blame. Men were extinguished from the record of life for less. Her moment of reverie was shattered by the sound of running feet. A guardian clattered up to her. He must come. There's been another murder. She turned and stumbled against him. His hands pushed her upright, and she found herself starting to memorize the way the folds of his garment fell. She shook her head, pushing him away. No, she must focus. She didn't remember everything she saw, but if her mind wandered, she would. She remembered the priest leaning close to her, saying, Save your gift. Like a well, we do not know how much you may hold. If we fill you over the brim, what may happen? You must lose the focus that allows your perfect recall. Cross your eyes, stare at the sky, anything to break the concentration required. They were the ones who gave her the mask, the falcon mask that let her filter in what she saw and hold it at arm's length instead of overwhelming her. The guardian was unfazed by her reaction. He shook the mask out of a pouch at his belt, handing it to her. Nemtari tied it on as quickly as possible, but already he was grasping her shoulder and shaking her. We must go. Come. She reached out for him. Questing fingers caught his forearm and then slid down to his hand. She paused at the roughness around his wrist, and then he pulled her hand up to her shoulder. Pulled her hand up to his shoulder, starting forwards, leaving her no choice but to follow. Nemtari followed him out of the courtyard into the streets, pushing her mind away from the questions that tried to force their way forward. Her job was not to ask. She thought about the incense that floated in Asora's chamber, recalling the curls and spirals that floated in the dim air. She pondered the sound of his thumb and forefinger rubbing together in frustration, the ridges on his fingers making an unusual sound. And all the while, they moved through the close streets, the dust rising with each footstep. She kept working at it, pushing away things that would make impressions until there was nothing but the moving haze of the guards back in front of her. All of this so the first clear and perfect thing she saw would imprint itself on her, like a stylus into papyrus, creating an immutable mark. Nemtari shuddered as she imagined what new horrors were going to be displayed before her. As sudden as a slap, the sharp scent of blood hit Nemtari's nose. She could also smell straw. The sounds of their feet indicated they were walking through it. A shadow passed over her. The temple, once again, always near the temple, she thought. The guardian halted her, standing in front of her. Perhaps he was trying to be kind and spare her, but as it was his job to fall before any harm coming to Aten, so it was her job to look. Pulling off the mask, she gestured him to one side. She blinked, her eyes trying to focus. The order in the other sites was missing. She heard a rustle from behind her and turned towards her guardian. A rough sack slammed down over her head. She sucked in a breath and coughed in the dust. And by then her assailant had her neck and the bend of his arm, cutting off her air. Namtari struggled, kicking at his legs. He pulled her up enough that her legs dangled from the ground, and the darkness covering her eyes became absolute. She had a second to wonder if they would find her body with the head of the sack's prior occupant sewn to her neck. And then she faded from consciousness. When she sat up in blindness, Namtari realized her hands were bound behind her. Her fingers groped over the hieroglyphs carved into the wall of her back. At her back, she was still in the temple. Furtive sounds came from her right, catching her attention. Turning, she ran her fingers over another sack whose contents kicked and fussed whenever she prodded it. She heard the high, piercing cry of a raptor. Was this to replace her head? Even past the dusty interior of the sack, she could smell blood and straw. She thought a moment and then realized she was at the site of another murder. The killer always staged his victims, and since he wasn't able to complete the first tableau, he must have returned. She felt the pouch beside her once again and pulled it close. Of course, she thought, a falcon, to symbolize Horus and the eyes, as well as the sets of sight. Namtari tried to still the bird lest it draw attention to her. She could hear faint scraping sounds, so he was still at work. But only be a matter of time until he returned for her. Closing her eyes against the dust and the half-light filtering through the cloth, she focused on her memories. Anything could help distract her right now, and as she struggled with the leather cords around her wrists. The images came to her in flashes, a mosaic of seconds before her abduction. The cords at her wrists were bound tight, but Namtari hoped that as she sweated they might loosen. She caught a glimpse in her mind's eye. The body of this victim leaned back against the wall at an angle. She'd momentarily seen the face, and once she'd accounted for the open wound where his nose was sliced off, Namtari found she recognized him. Most of the priests were young and recently indoctrinated into the beliefs of Aten, but a few of the old order accepted the loss of their gods and worshipped Akhenaten as their true and living embodiment of light. The dead man before her had converted to the new faith. She felt herself drawing away from the memory and then forced herself back again. There she saw one more time. Next to the body was a bag, visible through the opening, the long and wedged-shaped head of a crocodile. Next to the bag sat a brass ewer with a brownish stain on its lip. Then she realized the message wasn't there. The murderer was ready with the blood to paint it, but the interruption had stopped them. She felt the first knot loosen. When the binding gave, she froze, afraid the sound might give her away. Namtari forced her hands apart. Slipping out of the loop around her right hand, Namtari reached for the bag, and despite the temptation to pull it off, rather moved it until she found a tear in it and brought her eye up to that. She could see her captor, bent down ahead of her, painting in his victim's blood with the end of a reed. She felt around her ankles. He'd hobbled her, so he intended to take her someplace else after finishing here. If he moved her, no one might ever find her until it was too late. Her fingers worked at the lacings between her ankles, her nails picking at the tight coils of the knot she couldn't see. Namtari made her way through the knot connecting her feet, and when they were no longer bound, the cord still hung from her right ankle. All the while she was bumping the sack behind her. The falcon struggled, irritated by her blows. Her head flicked back to the murderer, but he paid the bird no mind. She stopped working on the hobble for a moment to reach out for the sack for the falcon. Namtari made quick work of the binding there, and then retied the bag with a knot that could slip easily with a sharp pull. She reached again for her ankles as the murderer stood up. Hands upon hips, he studied his work. She could see a solid red circle in front of the victim. This time the body bore the head of a crocodile. And then what she saw made her start. The killer's scarred arms bore the marks of 2 wristbands. She knew only one other person who wore such things, Asura. All the clues began to fall into place in her mind. She knew the man before her, but if she were a loyal follower of Akhenaten, she would never be able to utter his name. To do so would see her marked for execution for treason. The steady thumping sound of approaching feet caught Namtari's attention. The rhythm was measured and even, and as if they were bearing a litter. Only two people would coming this way in a litter, Akhenaten or Asora. She turned her head and to see the corridor behind her hooked to the right. The litter stopped outside in the wider corridor. Looking back, she found her captor walking towards her. She knew him. The beard and the hair confused her since he was used to seeing him with every bit of his hair shaven and his skin slicked with scented oil. She wanted to say his name, but couldn't make herself do it. He was gone, stricken from the roll of life, banished by the living light, but her perfect memory would never let her forget him. No wonder he had roamed unchallenged about the temple, for who could a guard report a man who did not exist, whose very name was a death sentence? As he approached her, Nemtari's thoughts raced. She considered all she had seen, trying to tie it together, but there was no time. Instead, she reached down and pulled the sack with the falcon into her hands. He smiled as he walked the last few steps, and then it hit her. The circle of blood made sense. It was the totality of the eclipse, the covering of the light. But Nemtari wondered how a man responsible for the safety of the pharaoh, who knew how hard it was to gain access to Akhenaten, could believe he could extinguish the living light. It did not matter, though, now, because he was right before her, and she could only put her desperate plan into action. He leaned down to her, and she struck him with the bag. And as he fell backwards in surprise, she pulled the string on the bag containing the falcon and thrust the flapping, squawking bird into his face. Startled, the bird turned with animosity on its erstwhile captor, his scream echoing in the confines of the temple corridor. One of the falcon's wings struck her head and she fell backward. And as Nemtari snapped her wrists apart, the bindings fell off. She could see the blood running down his face. He howled in pain as the falcon dug a talon across his eyelid. One arm covered his face, and the other flailed about until it connected with the raptor. The bird flew backward and struck the wall. Wings outspread, it lay there on the floor, continuing its high, piercing cry. And by then she was running down the corridor, past the body, away from the sounds of the litter. Risking a look back, she found her captor closing on her. As he continued to gain, she turned down the nearest corridor. Nemtari dashed into a room with an opening to the sky. Sunlight showed down on a raised altar covered with offerings of food and flowers, and as she neared the altar, she saw a doorway to her left. And then her feet went out from under her. The killer had grabbed the trailing binding on her ankle. She fell in front of the altar. The knot gave way, and she leapt on top of the upraised platform, scattering offerings everywhere as he lunged after her. His hand scrabbled among the fruit as she jumped down from the other side. Turning, she raced towards the open doorway. She kept running, not daring to look back until she realized the corridor was winding its way back to her starting point. Nemtari wasn't surprised when she found herself entering a large hall, a litter to one side. She tried to lead her pursuer away, but he came to a halt. She stopped too and turned in amazement to watch Asora stand up from the litter. For a moment, she refused to accept the impossible. And then she saw the cords of the muscles on his arms standing out as Asora held himself upright on the spear he'd thrust into the ground as he stood. His pursuer drew out his blade, almost the length of his forearm with a ragged toothed edge near the handle. It looked to be just the type of weapon for beheading his victims. He turned toward Asora and lunged. Nemtari spun on her heel and leapt for his feet. Her hand caught his ankle, and her elbow hooked in his shin, tripping him. But he plunged forward and thrust the knife at Asora. Nemtari reached up and caught the hand holding the blade and hung with all of her weight on it. The former protector of the pharaoh looked up at Asora, his face a blood-smeared mask of violence. Asora let go of the spear and fell forwards, his right knee striking the man's neck with all of his weight, crushing his throat. Nemtari hung onto her former captor, her hands around the hilt of the blade, the murderer thrashing like a dying snake. She realized as his movements came to a halt that Asora's eyes had never left hers. Panting, Nemtari lifted herself onto her forearms. Asora calmly reached down and pulled the blade from the dead man's fingers. The bearers stepped from behind the litter, lifted it up and brought it closer. And after they helped Asora up, her protector sat down on its lowest step. He looked at the body on the ground and said, "No one can know your name. Then no one will miss you. Put his body into the Nile. Only the crocodiles will enjoy him." He turned to Nemtari. But you figured it out, did you not? You knew, and you did your best to be my protector. I am very proud of you." She wanted to protest, to say that she'd failed, but Asura pulled her closer to him. He threw his immense arms around her. "Nemtari, I cannot protect you. I can barely protect the pharaoh. I need someone I can trust, someone capable of thinking on her own. There are many people out there who will harm you if you do nothing, but observe as you've been taught. Instead, you need to think, to act. You need to be more than just the eye of Horus if you want to survive in this world." She thought about what he'd said as she laid her head against his chest. Perhaps she needed the wings of Horus instead, to glide overhead, gaining a clear view, and then dive to strike the target. She, however, did not have the strength of someone like Asura. Maybe it was as he said. She needed to use her wits and their gift of memory instead. "I will protect you and the living light as long as I can." He pulled her tighter into his embrace and whispered in her ear, "Both of us shall sleep in peace because of your promise." And that is The Witness of the Senses. And the following story was published originally in The Realm Beyond, volume number 1, as well as a collection of my material called Trail of Indiscretion, Special Edition number 2, Diversiforms. It was a story about ancient Egypt that I was given an opportunity to write, and I enjoyed. Also wanted to do something that had to do with a character who had perfect memory. And Nemtari is an interesting person, and I would not be surprised if I don't end up writing something about her again. I also wanted to set it at a very special time. Whenever Akhenaten assumed his reign in Egypt, he went through and removed the images of all the old gods so that they would be replaced with Aten, which is the sun, which you can see over my shoulder, as the sole embodiment of a single god. And he was the living representation of that god on earth. So, again, an interesting time to try and set a story into. So, thanks for listening.